All right. Well, I will do introductions on our behalf. Our first colleague, Caesar McDowell, that I want to actually pass on his regrets. We're sad he's not here. He's the president of Interaction Institute for Social Change. He's a professor of practice and community development at MIT. So he's helped design and contribute to our session today. Now, Andrea Nagel is one of his colleagues. So we're happy that Andrea is with us. She's a senior associate with the Interaction Institute for Social Change. She designs and facilitates initiatives that address complex issues, building alignment, capacity, and community for sustained and equitable change. She has a real deep background in community organizing, community development, program design, and leadership development. I'm Ann O'Neill. I was the founding chief systems engineer for MTA New York City Transit. I established that systems capability within the agency to actually help improve capital project delivery. As a systems engineering catalyst and now consultant, I'm advising organizations that are looking to navigate and make that same transformation, build systems capacity within their organizations to achieve business outcomes. Jeremy Liu is co-founder of Creative Ecology Partners, serves as a design studio and incubator for urban, economic, and community development innovation. He's also a senior fellow with the Center for Infrastructure Equity at PolicyLink, which he'll talk about. It's a leading national research and action institute advancing economic and social equity in the U.S. So, Andrea, you want to kick us off?
All right. So notice that the spaces that you visited and stood on or around are the spaces in this pathway. And you have a handout in front of you that is the same as the slide. And each of these represents, we call it a space, but it actually represents a conversation. How many of you have ever participated, led a planning process of any kind?
Including going on vacation.
Okay, so if you have participated in a planning process, you know that these spaces represent typical kinds of conversations that people move through. Vision. What will be possible after we actually build the system and everything that we are working towards? After we're in that on our vacation, what will it feel like and be like to be on that beach or on those snowy slopes skiing down? Whatever the perfect vacation may look like for you. Problem and opportunity refers to what are the problems that we're trying to address in this planning process? What is the issue we're trying to actually impact? And if we dig a little deeper, what are the root causes of that problem? Because we don't want to come up with solutions in the solution space that address symptoms. So in the problem space, we want to do a little deeper digging and a little more rigorous investigation of what's at the root of the problem we're solving for, so that our solutions actually address the problem. Yeah. Yes.
And that, yeah.
Yes, you had a hand up.
As a Civil War buff, mine was the Mississippi River and a paddle wheel, so I could hear the other side of the Civil War story.
History. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yes. And notice that the problem space has a dash because the opposite of problem is opportunity. We want to do due diligence in identifying not only what is the root cause of the problem we're trying to address, but what are some of the assets? What are things that all work in? Because in any community or on any issue, there's always going to be bright spots. There's always going to be any system. People that are doing things just a little differently and are actually getting results. There's no system in the world that is a complete and utter failure. Somewhere, somehow, someone is trying to tweak something, do something. It may be totally below the radar screen, but there's something going on in that system that is trying to do some good things. And it behooves us to figure out where might that be in the system. So we want to be conscious of both sides of that equation, so that we can then come up with solutions and strategies that bridge the that get us, that, you know, bridge that difference between the vision and the problem, that actually address the root cause. And then in implementation space, we do what you all know well, like, okay, so what are the next steps, mid, short, mid, and long term? What are the resources? Who's going to be championing which actions? What are the metrics we use to measure our progress? All that kind of action planning, that's a little more granular, happens in the implementation. But here's the thing: the pathway design. So these are all the conversations that take place, right? It so happens that some of us are really drawn to some of those conversations more than others. How many of you folks are really visionary? Love to think of what's possible only. If only. Okay. So you might like vision space conversations a lot. How many folks are like, wait, you know what? I want to be sure you really crack this nut. I'm really interested in exploring the depth of this thing. You want to explore the problem, understand the fully. How many folks are like, come on, we got the solution, we don't need to do this, just do it. Solution. Okay. And how many folks are implementation oriented? They are good organizers, and like to sort of have a plan, have it all laid out, and Excel spreadsheet. Okay. Good. The thing is, we need you all. We need folks that are really oriented and good at each of those things. What happens in most planning processes, though, is all those conversations are happening at the same time. The vision space people are having vision conversations with that, so they don't live. The problem space conversations are, wait a minute, the solution space people are like, come on, why can't we just do this darn thing? It's so easy, it's obvious what we need to do next. In the pathway design space is where we, before any of those conversations are ever had, is where we decide how to sequence those conversations. In which order are these going to happen? We can't have three conversations at once. We cannot be in solution space, problem space, and vision space at the same time. It has us chasing our tail. It leads to a lot of frustrating planning process, which I'm sure you've all been part of at some point or another. So in pathway design, we'll sequence them, order them, figure out who needs to be in them, and in what time frame and how. So pathway design convenes a group of people that are a fractal of the system, a cross representation of the system we're trying to impact. And they become a design team that designs the process that the rest of the system is implementing. All this happens in a context, of course, because no system lives in a vacuum. We have to understand the social, political, economic factors, the trends that are underway, the key stakeholders. Who are the people that are needing to be engaged in this process? So if we're thinking about, right, I'm sure these are questions you ask yourselves in the planning processes that you are part of and you lead. So, stakeholders. If we're thinking about, let's just say we're designing for a transportation system, we need to be thinking about the implementers, the folks who are going to implement the decisions around the new transportation. Who are some of the implementers in any transportation system? Just take a guess. Who are some of those who have to live with, carry out the decision about this new system? Actualize. Who might those folks? Transit authority, city planner, bus drivers. Yes. What's that? Yes. The passengers could also be directly impacted. Those that are going to be living with the decisions. They may not have to carry them out. That's not their job, but they have to use it. The decision makers, the ones who have the positional power to put resources behind something to make something go. There's also blockers, folks who can absolutely stop something from going forward, either individually or collectively. And then we talk about experts, and we think about experts very broadly, not just those who are credentialed, but those with lived experience. So we just want to make a case for one other group, because even the folks that are most directly impacted are not necessarily the margins. It's really important to consider the margins in thinking about how to best design for a system we're trying to shift. And why do you think that is? Anybody venture a guess?
Why would we want to think about the margins?
They could become blockers if we don't think about them. They feel they haven't been included, their experience hasn't been validated.
Yep. So
There's opportunities. Yeah.
So let me tell you a quick story.
Curb cuts. Anyone know where they come from?
No, the story. Anybody know the story about the curb cuts? Okay. So in 1940s in Kalamazoo, Michigan, there was an effort to,
Actually, an experiment.
to try to help folks who were veterans in wheelchairs be able to get around the city more easily. So there was a suggestion made that there be a cut in the curb where the curb meets the street, so that vets in wheelchairs could get up and down and around more easily. Seemed to work really well. That idea was picked up by a disability activist in Berkeley, California. Took it there and convinced the city to do the same. So in Berkeley, all of a sudden there were curb cuts everywhere. By 1990, it made it into the ADA, the American Disabilities Act, and now is national policy. So who benefits? Who benefits from the curb cuts? Okay. Okay, so that's an unintended consequence in a system, right? That's a really good point. Thank you. So maybe not everyone, but certainly many more folks than for whom that initial strategy was intended. So now not only are the folks in wheelchairs able to move around, but elderly, folks carrying their groceries, children in carriages, runners, and so forth. But you make a good point. What about the folks who are visually impaired? How do we accommodate for that particular need? So by paying attention to somebody on the margins or a particular group on the margins, we can see that it actually benefits a much larger constituency of people. So you might be wondering, how do we get to the margins? How do we see the margins? How do we identify the margins? So one way is called snowball sampling. Anyone familiar with that strategy? You've probably done it. It's probably called something else where you live and work. The idea being that we get folks out into community, into our networks, as we're trying to engage people, and ask them, who are the folks that you can imagine aren't the usual suspects, aren't the folks that are typically engaged or involved? How do we get them involved? Ask them to list 10 people, and so on and so forth. So it is a multiplier, exponential effect. And that will often get to places and people beyond our imagination, right? What this requires, of course, is a certain consciousness. The idea that we may not know the margins, so we have to be very willing to be pushed to go beyond what we can imagine and beyond our field of vision. That we're always curious and willing to learn beyond what we already know. Because what's interesting is sometimes we know what we don't know. Right? We know we don't know about something, a subject, but sometimes we just can't imagine that we don't know what we don't know. And so this is about adopting a particular humility and a point of view that allows us to say, we really don't know we may not really know who's on the margins, but are we willing to take the journey to figure that out and know that we can't do it alone? So one of the things that can help us in this journey, or in this way of sort of assuming this consciousness, is to consider that in measuring the success of our efforts, we kind of want to look at 3 dimensions. So that if we want to build, an infrastructure that is equitable and resilient and adaptive, we actually really need to pay attention to process and relationship. And this has been talked about for the last 2 days pretty consistently from many of you in this room as presenters and from our keynote speakers. So how we make decisions, how we involve stakeholders, how we resolve conflicts, how we learn from one another, how we learn from our mistakes, how we measure our progress, how we build capacity to co-create, all those are processes. How can we be intentional about creating processes that are inclusive? And then in terms of relationship, are we building relationships across difference? Are we intentionally going beyond the folks that we are comfortable engaging? the folks we're already in relationship with? Are we willing to engage and build relationships with folks we aren't typically in conversation with? Fields of study, different folks from different races, classes, backgrounds, experience, age, perspective. Folks who might challenge our thinking, but who are willing to be in a room with to sort of learn together. Because one of the things we believe in very deeply is we get buy-in from bringing in. So one last thought about this particular model is that our work teaches us again and again that when there are relationship tensions or breakdowns, if you dig down deep enough, what you find is a process breakdown. So if you notice relationship tensions on your projects, on your teams, in your initiatives, likely 9 times out of 10 that the issue is a process breakdown. People are not clear on their roles, decision making is not clear, it's vague and ambiguous. On and on it goes, right? The process is not holding them well. The process is not helping them build trust. It's maybe actually getting in the way of their being able to do their best work. And that, of course, is going to affect the results. So if we are builders of the next generation infrastructure, I think we all appreciate that this is a process of co-creation. That's, again, been said so many times over the last 2 days. The question is with whom and how? With whom? What relationships? With folks on, how do we find those margins? And how do we do it in a way that creates the space and holds the space for all that diversity of experience and opinion? So that we can build those equitable, adaptive, and resilient infrastructures. So we believe that thinking about the margins is one way that will get us closer to that. And I'll end with this slide, which is, this is actually, I don't know if you can read it, nothing about us without us is for us. Powerful slogan. So this came out of the struggle of people with disabilities in South Africa in the 1990s. And it has since become sort of an operating principle and rallying cry for people's struggles on many other issues all over the world, which is if you want me to benefit, or if you want me to be part of the larger whole that is to be considered a stakeholder in this process and in this infrastructure, in this system, then I need to be involved. I need to be consulted. I need to be engaged. So leave you with that thought and turn it over to Anne.
Thank you, Andrea. So I want to, okay. Jeremy, you're here. Okay. So as we start thinking about moving through this process and having these kind of considerations, one of the things that really strikes me, and it occurred to me listening to our luncheon keynote as well, is how do we think about capacity building? How do we think about the people with the capability to think about designing the process that we're going to move through, or facilitating the conversations that we're going to have at any point along the way, along our journey. And what struck me with our luncheon speaker today was thinking about these resilience officers in these cities. That's going to be a pretty lonely job as the silo buster. If there's one of them and a whole big city with a whole lot of not only residents, but city agencies and departments, with all kinds of different functions. So I think it's an important thing to talk about capacity building and specifically building systems thinking and systems engineering capacity. So I want to talk about the challenges that one infrastructure agency faced, just to kind of paint the picture of what's involved, what the challenges are. So I'm going to pick on New York City Transit because it was an infrastructure agency that I worked with. And there was quite a significant project that got undertaken to transform the capability at the subway command center. So subway command center, you see just phones, and actually there's radio connections, but it was no eyes in the system. So everything was a function of calling to the different train operators across the system, calling to master tower locations, and you see very manual and electrical, mechanical kinds of equipment outside of, phones and intercoms. Well, this is what we were working towards building, this rail control center, significant amount of technology, much more real-time information, computer-based, which they hadn't had before. So the process in going through this, we had some real failures to communicate. Now, on the operating side, we had operations staff that was really not very engaged. They've got 24/7 service delivery because the subway doesn't shut down unless we're doing maintenance, but that's just a piece of it right at a time. So 24/7, they're focused on delivering service every day, no matter what the weather conditions, no matter what's going on. So they figured, look, this process is going to take a long time. We've got a lot of time to engage. So they put off getting involved. Another challenge that they were having as the project was unfolding, they were thinking about very different kinds of capability and tools moving from the old command center to the new control center. Some of that change was going to implicate roles that had been defined and negotiated with the unions. Now, those were not conversations that the operations managers were excited about having. So guess what? They put those off too. Meanwhile, the project design is getting underway. It's happening. Now, on the engineering side, we heard the engineers say, well, we tried asking operations what they wanted. They don't know. They can't really explain it to us. They can't tell us what they need. They can't tell us in terms of information that we can take on board. The other interesting challenge we got into was the engineers were very much taking at face value the information that operators were talking to them about. So where the operators had integrated consoles that took the radios and the phones and integrated them at their desk, they didn't know how to refer to that. So they would basically explain to the engineers, well, we need something, we need this, right, in the new control center. Well, the engineers literally thought, okay, they want this old analog, system that's been sitting on their desk. They're comfortable with it. Okay, we get it. There's much more. Well, we ended up deploying very old analog technology for the integrated voice communication systems in this brand new control center. It actually had, talk about consequence, it had major follow-on consequences because the analog system took up so much space, lots of racks. The HVAC system, the cooling system actually wasn't designed for it. So anyway, the issue was we did not have very good engagement, and that continued throughout. So one of the things that we started to recognize in hindsight, and as Andrew talked about during lunch, sometimes when you've got real failures, it can open people to consider change. And that's precisely what happened. So within 8 years of deploying the control center, we had an opportunity to do a capability upgrade for 2/3 of the subway system that would really impact the control center. And there was a complete openness to doing things differently because basically all the parties, the engineers, operations, and all the supporting entities all felt that they had to compromise and they weren't pleased with the outcomes. So we took advantage of that opportunity as I had stood up a systems engineering team within the agency to go in and intervene on that next program and start to address and explore those very issues and build those bridges, those conversations where we were having so much difficulty. So let's think about how we address these kind of poor results. I always like that picture because it's real, and if you can just sort of see from the expressions on people's faces, this was not a happy conversation. And this was engineering management, operations management, everybody who was on the hook in terms of deploying this. So we want to avoid these kinds of photo ops, right? So how do we think about developing systems awareness? I mean, first of all, I think an important thing is to recognize that we do need this, that there's this role and this function, as Andrea talked about, for thinking about some of the facilitation and the process as we move through and do our infrastructure designs and infrastructure development. And are we thinking about the people with the capacity to design those processes and to facilitate those conversations and to really bring those stakeholders together and construct meaningful ways to support that engagement and the order that engagement happens, which may be different. It will be different depending on the project, depending on the stakeholders who are involved. So I think one of the pieces that's important is to get a sense of our own systems aptitude. Where do we fit in this? Are we one of those people that can play a role in that space? Or do we need to enhance the project teams that we're on, the organizations that we're supporting, the networks that we're involved with? We need to actually bring in some of that capacity. And there's growing trends, certainly globally, if we focus on transportation for a minute, for instance, infrastructure agencies like New York City Transit, and I would say we were maybe the first in North America. We were the first in North America as a transit agency to become aware and begin addressing this capacity issue. But we were actually behind some of our colleagues internationally. So London Underground, for instance, has a systems engineering team of 115 staff. They really recognize the need for that capacity. Singapore Land Transport, 80 systems engineers on board. The Australian transit agencies are starting to develop those frameworks and bring in that capability. So there's really trends for this. There's also the Systems Engineering Research Center is starting to really look at, in their Helix project, what's the DNA of an effective systems practitioner? What does it take? What kind of aptitude is involved? What kinds of experience and training do people who are effective in these roles have? So I think these are important things for us to be aware of. Some other thoughts around the transformation I think that's going to be required in terms of infrastructure industry, infrastructure systems, is how do we start to build this awareness? So one outreach initiative that the Systems Engineering Society is trying to push is to actually grow and develop systems awareness and do systems foundational concept training as part of all engineering curriculum at the undergraduate level. You know, so any civil engineer that comes out of an engineering program, which think about the implication for physical infrastructure systems, if all of our civil engineers within, the next 4, 8, 12 years start graduating with this awareness. So even if they don't have the aptitude themselves, there's a broader awareness that they need to bring in someone as part of that team that can facilitate and fill in that function, right? I think in terms of industry and government, this is clearly another area that we're going to likewise need to develop that capacity. So in multiple ways, it's got to grow across the supply chain. So one of our speakers this morning was talking about, well, you can put these requirements into your contracts, look for systems holistic activities, require that it happen, require that people think about the life cycle. Well, if the agency who's putting that contract together doesn't have the capacity to qualify the people who are going to respond to that, whether it's the design engineers who will be outsourced to support them, whether it's the contractors or the systems integrators, guess what? You're not going to get it, even if it is in your contract. And conversely, all of those players then in the supply chain need to develop their own capacity to be in a position to actually deliver and support these infrastructure agencies in these processes, right? Okay, so Jeremy. Here's your clicker.
Sorry, thank you. Hold on one sec. So my name is Jeremy Liu. I have a small firm that does consulting work around technology and community development and innovation and thinking about strategies for doing that work. Yeah. How do I do this? That's Creative Ecology Partners, but I'm also a senior fellow at the PolicyLink Center for Infrastructure Equity, which is really focused on how we can build the next, really adapt and build the next generation of infrastructure to address equity issues. Similar, I think, and it was gratifying to hear about Andrew's presentation over lunch, is how resiliency and sort of the demand drivers of infrastructure in the next set of work that we do as a society are actually going to have the potential to really drive equity as a core value. And so that's the work that we do at PolicyLink. So what I want to talk about is the fact that I'm sort of making the case for human-centered design, right? So I have a couple of examples to run through. And are folks familiar with that term, just generally, human-centered design? So maybe a quick sort of explanation. And so I don't know if someone wants to offer some thoughts about it from the audience, if you do know it. Anybody? Someone, you were shaking. No, you were saying you didn't know. Okay, so human-centered design is really trying to put the human at the center of what you're about design. So echoed a lot in Andrea and Anne's conversation is, for example, in the design of the process, or be focused on the user as a core driver of design features. So ergonomics is actually a dimension of it, for sure. It's a physical usability type, but in sort of living the usability question on the whole person, right? The whole. And so I have a couple of examples I want to share with you that sort of get at following on this idea of transportation as the example infrastructure. So that's just a quick summary about Creative Ecology Partners. So Bay Area Rapid Transit. I'm going to turn this on. So Bay Area Rapid Transit. On the left, you see the planned original infrastructure system of the Bay Area Rapid Transit. On the left-hand side, you see a huge spur up into Marin County, which is one of the 5 or 6 Bay Area counties. You see a large spur on the peninsula coming down. On the right, you basically have what got built. And you see that those 2 spurs are largely missing. Millbrae, the end of the peninsula, is roughly about here. Right, so the two western trunks of the Bay Area Rapid Transit System were effectively truncated, largely due to political and community opposition to sort of subway lines coming in, a public transit line coming into the neighborhood. There was a fair amount of sort of racism-based sort of, we don't want urban folks coming into our communities. That literally cut off 2 of the 5 main spurs to BART. Similarly, on the left, you see in the Boston subway system, It's a little hard to see the image on the left, but there was a plan at one point for a much broader and longer and bigger network. On the right, you see essentially a zoom in, and that inside the most inner circle is really what got built. And only now, 30 years later, are they starting to build some of the eventual longer pieces of that system. So two examples of little gaps in our infrastructure that get created because of essentially a human design intervention, right? Where social units as a whole get together and say, we're going to influence the system that is getting proposed and built, and we were actually going to control it. And if you talk about results, right, they had very good results, right? They effectively stopped major pieces of infrastructure coming into their communities. On the other hand, you have human design built off of infrastructure like a transit system that's filling gaps, right? So on the left, you essentially a very probably well recognized map of the New York City transit system. On the right, you have a map from a New Yorker report that really mapped out with, in a lot of ways, similar graphic design of all the informal transit systems in New York City. Each of those lines on the right is a private licensed or unlicensed bus route, or private shuttle route, or jitney, or dollar van is what they're called often, or $2 van now. That some go between Chinatowns, some go serve a lot of the immigrant Latino community on the New Jersey side. Some even literally have on the Bronx section in White Plains there. There is actually even a set of private jitney services that filled in a gap that the MTA created when they stopped serving a route, right? So you have the social human dimension actually filling gaps in an infrastructure system. Also pointing out, again, as others have emphasized, that this is just taken from sort of an example of Portland, is that the complexity of the human interaction, right, that is required in order to fulfill moving forward on any of our, again, transportation systems. This gives you a sense of all the different pieces that are in isolation working, and how do you work together. This next part that I want to talk about actually speaks to the idea that there actually are now human-centered design tools that are being developed to serve transportation infrastructure development. This is actually one created by the Center for Neighborhood Technology. It's been adopted by HUD, Housing and Urban Development. And what it is using a normal affordability index. HUD has an affordability index that's based on a percentage of income that's required to afford a home. Typically, it's 30%. On the left-hand side, you see that the housing costs as a percentage of income in the Washington, D.C. metro area is about 28%. Seems like it's affordable. But if you factor in transportation costs, which is essentially an essential function of making your home usable for the life you want to lead, right? How do you get to and from work? How do you get to and from amenities and services? It's actually a 42% cost. So it creates a dimension of understanding that really factors in the human, the human need and how you use housing. Similarly, these are not necessarily. This is not necessarily the image is not necessarily the transportation cost index graphic. It's sort of starting to illustrate the fact that at Portland State University, they're now developing a transportation cost index that's based on the consumer price index and how you use transit based on a very human design focused usability perspective. So basically the main metrics of transportation have been cost per mile, cost per trip, but what they're starting to do with the transportation cost index is bucket the use of transportation into the uses that people have. So the fact that people value the efficiency and on-time delivery of mobility for work probably more than they do for shopping, for example, right? That there's differential value that we place in using transportation over different types of uses, they're starting to develop a cost index that tries to take that into account. Again, a human-focused orientation towards coming up with tools and analysis. There's just another quick example is a tool that's gamified transportation planning, so really understanding how people find transportation usability in terms of the planning basis. Just an example, it's called Remix. It makes it very simple to use, but also engaging in a way that makes it accessible to others. So those first set of slides is really talking about where human design shows up, both as affecting systems, but also some of the new tools that are being developed. I want to talk about one last tool, really, and it's something that PolicyLink has developed. So PolicyLink is a National Research and Action Institute. One of our areas is the Center for Infrastructure Equity. And we're really looking for in developing transportation policies, advance economic and social equity, right? So really trying to understand how systems like transportation, public transportation, for example, support not just the mobility goals, but equity goals. One of the ways we do that is our Transportation Equity Initiative, making sure that there's engagement of broad sets of users, the margins, as Andrea talked about, in the design of transportation. Just some details about that. And there has been some really interesting success in this. One of the most recent ones is the Department of Transportation, until very recently, has not been able to do local hire as part of their preferential hire as part of their sort of contracting work, and they're starting to pilot looking at local hire as a way of meeting some equity goals around economic benefits of transportation, in addition to the end use of transportation itself. This last piece I'll offer is that we've developed something called the National Equity Atlas, and it's potentially a tool that can be used by folks in the field, particularly doing research, to understand how investments in infrastructure can contribute to reaching equity goals. So as Andrew was speaking over lunch, the whole resilient cities goal is to actually see how cities can achieve equity goals as well as resiliency goals at the same time. How do you measure equity? This is a tool that helps do that, and it is developed by USC and PolicyLink together. And I won't go into the details of the specific tool, but so if you go to nationalequityatlas.org, you can look at some of the uses of it. And that's just my information, so thank you.
All right. So one of the things we're really interested in doing, if we're going to start to create transformative change, one of the best places to start is among ourselves, because we're very directly engaged with infrastructure systems in various ways. So one of the things we thought we would invite you guys to do in terms of a bit of a conversation, if we can join back into small group tables. Thanks. And we've got somebody new. You're welcome to join one of our small groups. So one of the things we'd invite you to initially, we're going to kind of talk about these two pieces. So one area is certainly what ideas that were presented today are you most intrigued by and would be interested in taking it forward into your own work, into your own networks. And then secondly, what kind of challenges would you foresee in adopting more of a human-centered design approach in the infrastructure work that you're doing? So if you could just share that, we'll give a little bit of time in the small groups to talk about these two aspects. Okay? Are we good? I don't want to interrupt Nick. He usually has deep thoughts. Okay. Thank you guys for being so engaged from our opening exercise to the small group discussions. We're very interested to get a little bit of insight on what you guys have been talking about. Anyone willing to share an idea that you heard? It could be your own. It could be something someone else in your group said. Anyone intrigued by an aspect of the human-centered design concepts and ideas that we put forward? Who has an idea that they'd want to share? Please.
So some of the work that we're doing with right now, looking at how to develop infrastructure, specifically critical infrastructure. There's activities called pre-development activities, things you need to do before. There's these things called pre-development activities that need to be done before any shovel hits the ground or any such things. And one of the reasons why my team wanted to come to this is because one of those pre-development activities that's defined is community outreach and engagement.
Yes.
And so we want to learn how to do that more and better, so we can actually write that into our analysis and our report for DHS. And they're interested in it. They've asked us about it specifically. So we found that interesting from that point of view, trying to understand. And I think the way we were looking at it sometimes is trying to understand what their risks are. We can do a traditional risk assessment. If you're in the Homeland Security field or a lot of other fields, we do a lot of different risk analysis and risk assessments. A lot of different fields do, but those sometimes tend to be very quantitative and very structured and rigid. And we thought that community engagement can be an opportunity to not only identify risk, but to also relate risk. So it's a pull-push information of education for the community and education for the owners or operators of the critical infrastructure.
Absolutely. I'd be curious then, either you or some of your other colleagues from DHS, were there any challenges that you would see in trying to implement some of those ideas around the community engagement? Or do you think some of what was presented would be things you could take forward fairly readily?
I think getting buy-in from a variety of policymakers versus just wanting to get straight to the solution space and implementation space, that can be difficult to sometimes make the case for softer type approaches versus just we need to harden and make this facility secure.
Definitely. That's a good point. And that was certainly one of the areas in my infrastructure agency that we were aware of undertaking some of this. And we thought about some of that pushback we might encounter in terms of, I think, twofold. One, we're often pressured for time in the front end in the planning, right? It might take a significant amount of time to even get our green lights and funding lined up for some of these major infrastructure projects. And so to then think about taking additional time for activities on the front end, whether it's community engagement or stakeholder engagement in a broader sense. So it'd be interesting to think about, and some of what we anticipated in terms of building the business case was looking at where things hadn't gone well because we had missed key stakeholder input and there were consequences of that, and being able to demonstrate how we could address it. Yeah. Who else had another thought in the back?
I'm not speaking for our table, but just kind of piggybacking off of what Alex shared, kind of this idea of relationship tensions being found in process breakdowns. I think when we're thinking about community outreach and stakeholder engagement, a lot of times we think about relationship tensions just being in either differences of opinion, or they're just hard to get along with, or we want to do things a different way, but maybe really kind of being able to step back and look at what processes are taking place in the infrastructure pre-development phases,
right.
And the development, kind of throughout the life cycle, and kind of looking at where the community should and can be engaged in those things, and not even beyond just the process of stakeholder engagement, but
Right.
where relationship tensions could be created there. So
Right.
I just thought that was kind of interesting. Oh, right. Yeah. So I recently had the opportunity to go with the Infrastructure Development and Recovery Program, which is a new program that the Department of Homeland Security is standing up. And we visited the Loudoun County Water Project. They're building a massive new kind of state-of-the-art water infrastructure that's going to be providing water to Loudoun County. So one of the things that they had to do during their stakeholder engagement process was work with a community that was, it's actually right next door to where they're building the water intake facility, but the community that's next to them is not even going to benefit from a drop of that water because they receive their water from another community. So they really had to do quite a bit of stakeholder outreach and engagement and work with the community to find a solution that would be acceptable for them in terms of, having this massive facility kind of right across from their properties, affecting their property values and such. So they worked to add a lot of sound attenuation features and a lot of features that would make it visually more appealing. And the facility is actually going to look like a house with a slate roof and chimneys and so on and so forth. So, and then of course they continue to engage the community through, and not just the community, but the stakeholders and those who are affected by the project through newsletters and other kinds of meetings with HOAs and things like that.
Basis.
So yeah, it's been extremely important and has allowed the project to move forward successfully with good communities.
That's great. Thanks for sharing that. Anybody else who wants to share reactions to something intriguing? Fred?
Distinguish between engagement activities that are sincerely intended to elicit interests and preferences from people and the public, and those that are essentially selling or pushing conclusions that have already been made at some other level or location. And in my experience, an awful lot of what's called outreach by agencies, both public and private, is selling rather than asking. And I think it's important that something in the ethics of the process should favor the asking.
Yeah, which really underscores, I think, both Andrea and a number of our presenters have talked about this context of co-creation, right? So are we transparent about our intent for engaging stakeholders, engaging the community? And so if we're thinking about our process design, we're thinking about the intent. I mean, that's certainly something that's important to understand, why are you going through this process? What are your goals and outcomes? What are you looking to achieve? Yeah. And I think Nick had raised an interesting point too, in terms of how we scale some of these things. I mean, it will be fantastic from my perspective if we get a whole lot of infrastructure agencies starting to look at engaging our community, but I live in New York City. So on a practical basis, what's the frequency with which we can do that? On an ongoing basis, how do we realistically reach to the margins and get very broad demographic engagement? Nick, do you want to make a comment on that?
Thanks very much. I think the answer to that is it's permanent. And actually, personally, I prefer the word empowerment because at the end of the day, if an authority decides to build a water facility or a metro or a bridge or whatever it is, that's a relatively short thing in the lifetime of a community. Yes. And actually, the period that they're doing their stakeholder engagement is tiny compared with the life of the people who are there and the generations that actually constitute a community. Therefore, it has to be permanent. And I think, although I wouldn't for a minute say it is 100% successful, London has a very interesting example because the structure of the way that London thinks about its planning is that we have a thing called the Mayor's Strategic Plan for London. That has a 20-year vision. And from that strategic plan, everything else falls. So if you have a transport plan or a housing plan or an immigration plan or whatever it is plan, they all hang off this strategy. The strategy has a vision of 20 years, and it is continuous. So it is on a continuous renewal process. It takes 4 years to do the consultation, to go around and produce a revised version of the strategic plan. And the mayor commits to that vision. So as the mayoral cycle is 4 years, you begin to find that a mayor gets elected and he has the previous mayor's vision or strategy to enact. So he has to, or she has to then work out how their own political preferences work to fit that vision. And what that has done is it means that the overall strategic plan of London is one for London and is basically apolitical, because in the end everybody has to buy it. And that process is, so it's not that it's static and set in stone forever. It's under constant reappraisal the whole time. And I think that is the message I think that agencies need to take home, is that this is not something you do for a project. And they should stop thinking about projects. It's something you do because that's what your city or your country or whatever it is, that's what it needs. And that is the overarching vision. And if you go with that view, so basically London would take the view that it wishes to be a global economic centre and all that sort of stuff. You know, Transport for London will then say we're going to have this bus route, or we're going to develop that metro line in order to help London become that thing. But that overarching vision is the thing that drives the whole piece, and therefore you have this permanent sort of revision of that, because it's what you need to do in order to keep that in place. And all the individual projects that go into fire that are then linked to it, and it makes it a lot easier.
Yeah, fantastic. Colin, and then okay, can you give me a sound bite, Colin, and then Chris, and then I think we're going to need to wrap up.
It's following on from Nick in a sense, and also coupling to what you were saying. We've been talking about next generation infrastructure, talking mainly about the artifacts and the systems. Next generation infrastructure is going to be conceived and delivered by next generation people. And it's not just the engineers and the technologists, it's the citizens who are going to deliver it as well. So in parallel with thinking about all the nice techie stuff, we need to be developing the next generation people who are smart enough to create better infrastructure than we do at the moment. And this might perhaps be a theme for the next conference, how we develop the people. And it's not just the engineers.
Thank you, Colin. That's a very good point. And Chris, if you want to close us out. Thanks.
Okay, I've just been reflecting on this diagram, which you put up, and then looking at when and who should engage at which point. So certainly the vision, I think, is something that needs to be collective, and it is sometimes done by people elected on behalf of the people, but essentially it should be by bringing the whole of the people together in some sort of way, so they have an input to it. Exploring the problem is something also that requires all stakeholders and buy-in, and so you would have citizens as well as professionals, but a complete range of professionals at that particular point. When it comes to the solution space, that's when the ingenuity is required, and that's where the engineers will come in. Now, I say this for two reasons. One is you then have pathway design and space. Now, I would then put that to the other side of the solution space before you get to the implementation space. So I would change your diagram around a little. In iteration is good. Now, one of the lessons that we learned from our multidisciplinary work is that if you've got a bunch of engineers and you've got a bunch of problems, what the engineers will do is solve the problems.
Of course.
And so the problem is X, and the engineer will say, well, what you need to do. And of course, when we then had social scientists and engineers working together, the social scientists immediately said, you're just being an engineer, you're jumping to the solution, you're not spending time on the problem. And what the engineers informed the social scientists is that there has to be, in fact, a solution. And it isn't just a question of going around the problem ad infinitum. And of course, bringing all that lot together leads to a better point. But I think it's understanding where the various stakeholders can engage properly within this process
Yes, Andrea,
leads
do you
to
wanna say?
a better outcome.